Hello and welcome. My name is Bijan Ahmadi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. IPD is a non-profit and non-partisan foreign policy think tank operating in Canada and the United States, dedicated to promoting dialogue, diplomacy, prudent realism, and military restraint. Today, we're hosting another interesting discussion in collaboration with InterVistas Consulting about civil aviation. This panel is part of IPD's Canada's Role on the Global Stage research program. Our discussion today is titled Keeping the Sky Safe, Prospects for Global Cooperation. With the second anniversary of the tragic downing of flight PS752 approaching soon, and a year after the inaugural Safer Skies Forum in December 2020, an initiative of the Canadian government, this timely joint panel organized by the IPD and InterVistas Consulting brings together distinguished experts to reflect on Canada's ongoing efforts on protection of civilian flight operations in and around conflict zones, and discuss how to best achieve progress on the Safer Skies commitments. To lead this discussion, we have Marcelo Garcia, Senior Director at InterVistas Consulting. Marcelo has broad experience in policy and global advocacy matters in regulated industries. On the aviation front, he has worked with Canada's Department of Transport, based in Ottawa, and with Qatar Air Base, Aeropolitical and Regulatory Affairs at Qatar Air Base. He has advised airlines and industry associations on a wide array of legal and regulatory issues. Marcelo has also advised the Canadian government on airline joint ventures and competition law. He holds a Master of Laws from McGill's Institute of Air and Space Law in Montreal. He has also earned common law and civil law degrees from McGill University. Marcelo, thanks to you and InterVistas for co-hosting this event with us and for your support in making this event possible. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bijan. Well, first of all, good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening to our audience watching from around the world. As Bijan was mentioning, we at InterVistas are very pleased to partner with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. And one of the things we like most here is that we promote open and non-partisan dialogue on the most relevant policy and geopolitical issues affecting aviation. And this is our third series of webinars. I will be your moderator today, and we're very, very lucky to have four great speakers, great panelists with a lot of experience that I will introduce in a second. But first of all, let me go over a little bit through the topic of today. Our panel today, in my view, is very timely and relevant. 1 year ago, the Canadian Minister of Transport, Marc Garneau, launched the Safer Skies initiative, which was considered or is considered to this day Canada's response to the downing of Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752. The Safer Skies initiative aims to enable states to improve safety of air travel and address current gaps in information sharing and capacity building. Today, our aim is to re-energize the global discussion around safety of air operations in and around conflict zones. I think this is very relevant in light of recent conflicts in Azerbaijan, Armenia in 2020, Ethiopia, and the ongoing tensions in Crimea these days. So in terms of our panelists today, they have a track record of leadership in aviation security and extensive experience on the ground. They have worked for governments, international organizations, industry associations, as well as global airlines. Our discussion today will be articulated around three themes. First of all, where are we, the global aviation community, in terms of conflict zone management and risk mitigation strategies? Second, how are governments and industry coming together to progress on making the sky safer for civilian operations? And last, what are the opportunities and challenges ahead? In other words, how can we do better? Our first panelist today is John Velio. John is Canada's lead on the Safer Skies initiative at ICAO and current Director, Passenger Protect Program and Target Operations at Transport Canada. He has more than 20 years experience in different areas in transportation, programs, corporate finance, rail, marine, aviation, and multimodal training. Welcome to the panel, John.
Just, can you hear me, Marcelo? Yes?
Yeah.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. First, thank you very much to InterVista and Marcelo for inviting me to this this panel. Really looking forward to having this discussion with you. It's a pleasure to be discussing the Safer Skies initiative, an initiative that is really, really important, not only for Canada, but for victims of air crash disaster as well. So really looking forward to some of your questions at the end. But before I get into the work that we're currently doing with our international partners, let me give you a little bit of background in terms of the actual initiative. First, the Safer Skies initiative is not really a new initiative. It's really the continuation of what our Dutch colleagues have started post MH17. I want to take you back to January 8, 2020, when the government of Canada was working with its partners and looking at different images, different information to determine what caused the downing of PS752. We were looking at the satellite images, and there was a lot of airplanes flying before and post PS752. And of course, that's despite the work that was done by our colleagues, the Dutch, following MH17, the guidance that was introduced through ICAO, the different risk triggers that we saw at that time. There were still a lot of civil commercial aircraft flying. That's when we knew that we actually had to do something globally to initiate that culture change in order to better address conflict zone risks and how the airspace was being managed. So Transport Canada acted swiftly to engage our international partners and to lead global efforts to mitigate these risks to civil aviation posed near or in conflict zones. Actually, on February 14, 2020, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, announced the Canadian Lead Safer Skies initiative, which his objective was to improve the safety of air travel worldwide by addressing gaps that we saw on January 8th on how states and industry were dealing with conflict zones. This really gave us the political will to advance this file and to actually engage with our international community and look at what can we do in order to address these gaps that we're seeing. And of course, despite the work that's already being done in this area. The initiative was formulated to bring together international partners, including countries, airlines, or international organizations, to establish a common set of practices to better protect passengers from the risks of flying into or near conflict zones. Again, what this means is really a culture change on how states and industry are managing risks in conflict zones. So Canada's approach to Safer Skies is really focused on two tracks. The first one, we built a domestic program. So basically building that domestic capacity and act as an influencer to states to address conflict zones risks. So we actually now have a team that does 24/7 monitoring of conflict zone risks and actually work with our international community in that space. The second track is really advancing the Safer Skies initiative, which includes, of course, looking at global practices, looking at standards, recommended practices, leveraging international organization to basically build capacity on the way the world is addressing these risks. So let's talk about the Safer Skies initiative. So really, TC leads two global initiatives that bring these partners together, which is basically the Safer Skies Consultative Committee, which I'll talk to you in a second, and the Safer Skies Forum, which is also a deliverable of the Safer Skies Consultative Committee. So the Safer Skies Consultative Committee is a multilateral group that brings together subject matter experts from different states and different organizations. It was formed in July 2020 to achieve measurable global results in conflict zones. Its main functions are to support the work of states, regional coordination groups, air operators, industry, associations, and international organizations on all matters pertaining to conflict zones. We really want to bring together that expertise and leverage that expertise globally. Second, it's to promote best practices through regulators, air navigation service providers, air operators, regarding risk assessment methodologies and mitigation strategies. We really want to make sure that there's an inventory of mitigation strategies that could be considered when these risks are identified in or near conflict zones. And one important function is also to enable information sharing. So it's really to encourage that broader dialogue between relevant parties on how we're actually implementing these mitigation strategies. And last, we do want to advocate for the consideration, modification, or implementation of ICAO SARPs. ICAO plays a huge role in establishing that benchmarking state obligations, and we really want to reinforce the implementation of those SARPs. The SSCC has met several times. It has an ambitious work plan. Just to give you an idea, the SSCC is actually working right now on establishing conflict zone risk mitigation strategies. So it's an inventory that states could take into consideration when they're doing the risk assessments. We're basically identifying and evaluating current international communication forums for rapid info sharing. Just give me a second here. My phone is ringing. This is embarrassing. Basically, we want to encourage that broad info sharing, and it has to be also timely. As we saw through various reports, info sharing is always a challenge, and we really want to address that. The committee is also agreed to take on the recommendations that were recently put forward by the Dutch Safety Board in the recent report, Safe Flight Routes Response to Escalating Conflicts, where we want to work on innovation and risk assessments and criteria for airspace closure. Canada, along with the SSCC, will also host the second Safer Skies Forum, Marcelo, which you made reference to. This year is really about dig deeper into the topics that were covered last year, such as info sharing best practices. What have we learned over the last year? How can we drive that info sharing? Risk assessment methodologies. There are some methodologies that could be shared. And of course, looking at adequate risk mitigations that should be considered for states in conflict zones or states with operators flying into conflict zones. So again, Canada remains committed. We have our returning Minister of Transport, Minister El Gabra, which has taken every opportunity to promote the Safer Skies initiative. And we really look forward to working with our international partners on this exciting initiative. Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you, John. I appreciate your comments, and I think that describing the background of the Safer Skies initiative, I was just wondering if this model that Canada has established of having a domestic program and an international program based on cooperation is something that could be exported to other countries. But we'll get to it during a roundtable discussion. Now, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Matthew Vogen. He's the current Director, Aviation Security and Cyber at the International Air Transport Association, based in Montreal. Matthew has over 20 years of experience in security management, occupying different roles, law enforcement, government, and private sector. He was previously the head of aviation security at Etihad Airways, based in Abu Dhabi. Welcome, Matthew. We're very pleased to have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Marcelo. Good morning, everyone from Montreal. So just quickly, fully support and echo John's introduction there. And so I'm going to walk the tightrope of making sure that I don't repeat anything that John says, but try to complement and to the degree that we can nuance some of those points made. So, quite simply, the issue of conflict zones, it's not brand new, and the occurrence that took place in July 2014 is just one of what you could argue as a legacy of historical military to civilian type activities that have taken place as far back as the 1980s. Ironically, not far from that part of the world. So But what John said, that was really critical to the mission of bringing governments and industry together, is for us, from an IATA perspective, it's not only to address the gaps, which evidently, it was only January 2020 that we saw that fatal event. So evidently there is a gap. We can't just ignore that there isn't any work here to do and nothing more to improve. But close gaps, but also continue to work on emerging risk and developing emerging capabilities for perhaps what we don't necessarily know or understand in a clear sense today. And I think a gentleman from the Pentagon many years ago phrased, the word "the unknown unknowns," right? And specifically within the space of conflict zones, that is where that opportunity, at least from what we've seen, most certainly in the last sort of 18 months, that is where we need to continue to focus on and largely develop capabilities for things that we probably haven't necessarily thought about, or at least have the international framework in place to be able to adjust to that. I think secondly, just from an IATA point of view, before I hand over, or at least a member airline point of view, information sharing is all well and good, and it's an infinite mission, right? It's an infinite kind of principle that we adhere to, but it's got to be more than that, right? It's got to be the timely piece, and probably the most key word out of that is it has to be relevant. And I think if you can get the sweet spot between information sharing that is timely and relevant, you will start to see the nature of hostilities and the way that civil aviation correlates or operates over or in and out of those locations. You will start to see much more of a business resilience and operations resilience culture than perhaps what we see today, which is essentially close down the airspace and then spend some time to work out what we're actually looking for. And I think we will continue to work on that through the Safe Skies Committee that Transport Canada has led, and of course with our other partners in Hani and Nico coming up. Thanks again.
Thank you, Matthew, for those comments. Perhaps would you like to perhaps summarize very quickly what IATA is doing globally as an association at the level of ICAO, but perhaps at the level of other regional international organizations to advance this topic?
Yeah, so quite simply, we are leveraging our sort of information partners, right? And Medair is one of them on this call. We sort of universally call them our strategic partners, and that's most certainly not a hard sell in the sense that I don't need you to buy fries with what I'm saying here, but we continue to use their analysis, their sort of platform to potentially socialize some of those gaps, information sharing gaps that we see between government and industry today. So IATA is a regionalized organization, so we do have capabilities in certain parts of the world that give us that reach deep into some of these airlines that make safety, security, aircraft dispatch decisions on a daily down to an hourly basis. And again, I go back to the previous comment about developing the resilience around the airspace, and so a large part of that regional work is leveraging contingency arrangements that may or may not be in place depending on the capabilities of the airspace service provider. And as we go forward in this discussion, I guess that's something we can tease out with Nico in terms of ANSP and ICAO coordination of either airspace closure or at least air route compromise to conflict zones.
Thank you, Matthew, for those additional comments. So our third panelist today is Nico Verba. He's the current director of ICAO Affairs at the Civil Air Navigation Services Organization, also known as CANSO. Nico was a commercial pilot for 24 years at KLM, and he's occupied various industry positions, including at the European Cockpit Association, always related to aviation security. He also has a deep understanding of aviation security from an operational and labor relations perspectives. Welcome, Nico, to this panel. We're extremely pleased to have you with us. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, and I would like to thank, as the others did, the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy, but also Intervistas for inviting us and having this discussion on a very timely basis. And I think the more we talk about it, the more the risks and are known, and that we really have to do something. It's very important. I want to go back a bit to the MH17 incident. At that time, I was still an airline pilot with KLM flying 777. And 2 days before the shutdown of the Malaysian 17, I was flying myself from Malaysia on the same route over the same airspace. At that time, we made a risk assessment on how is the risk, and risk at that time was more or less determined by capability times intent. So are people capable of shooting down an aircraft? And I think everybody was agreeing at that time that yes, they were capable, but there was no intent, because none of the forces fighting there had any benefit of shooting down an airliner. It was even hurting their own causes. So our risk assessment at that time was there is no risk, because if the intent is zero, then the risk is zero. What we didn't take into account is the collateral damage that comes out of failures of systems or operations, or and that is what happened. So we had to, at that time, make a readjustment of risk assessment. What we see as air traffic management is that, yes, we are there to make the airspace and the flights safe, but we can only do that if we have enough information. And for that, you need the information to be shared. And as Matthew said, it has to be timely, complete, and relevant. And that is sometimes lacking. And that is because of different issues. It could be political, it could be intelligence-wise, but we have to make the world known that sharing of information with all the relevant stakeholders, if it's airlines, if it's adjacent states, if it's air navigation service providers, is very important. And not only the states, but the military civil coordination is very important as well. And I want to go deeper in that a bit later. But I think that is the most important thing that has to come out of it. We have to have the information ready for all relevant stakeholders so that they can make a risk assessment based on what information is there. And it has to be timely and it has to be relevant. Thank you. And you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you, Nico. One question that came to mind as well, based on your experience with industry associations representing pilots' interest, I would like perhaps if you can make a few comments about how these associations tackle this issue and what are the most relevant advocacy points that they're pushing in different institutions and organizations.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's very important. What you see is that when I was the president of the European Pilots Association, ECA, we had some questions of pilots from airlines who were told by their airline to fly into an area what they thought, based on the information available on the public platforms, was not safe. But their airline was told, well, we have our needs there, you have to fly there, and our risk assessment says it's safe. The problem comes when you don't share where that information and that risk assessment comes from. And you have to be, all parties have to be aware of why the risk assessment is made, what it's based on, and how do you determine it's safe or it's not safe. There will be a lot of consequences for closing an airport, an airspace, for example, economical, political, those issues, revenues, that's another thing that always comes into place. But to make sure that you make the relevant risk assessment, it's very important that you have the available information there, but also share the outcome of your risk assessment with the relevant parties and where it's based on. And as I said, what you saw during my time as president of the European Pilots Association is that if information is not shared, for example, with pilots, how the risk assessment is done and why it's safe, you get a big of disputes between your staff and company, because you don't know if it's safe. You base yourself on information that is not complete, perhaps.
Thank you, Nico, for that follow-up. Well, last but not least, I'd like to welcome Hani Bakker. He's Senior Vice President, Aviation and Maritime Security at Medair, an international SOS company. He was previously a Regional Officer, Aviation Security and Facilitation at ICAO's Middle East Regional Office. And he was previously with Qatar Airways, occupying different aviation security roles, including acting vice president for the group security. I've been fortunate enough to work alongside Hani, because I was with Qatar Airways in the past as well, where we've done actually one risk assessment of a country in Central Asia. So welcome, Hani, and please go ahead.
Marcelo, thank you very much for having me on this great panel. So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Bijan, the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and certainly Intervistas, and this great panel with me here, my colleagues on the call. So I'll try to bring in a flavor from an air operator's perspective, and perhaps speak to some of the challenges and opportunities that have been experienced and currently are experienced by a number of air operators globally. So as a lot of us on the call know, that parts of the Middle East and Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even Eastern Europe are under either flight operations restrictions or prohibitions by a number of states or by a number of air operators. They impose those restrictions upon themselves, whereas flight operations are either restricted to a certain height or prohibited or limited to certain airways, or completely unable to operate. So beyond those regions, even, you've got those border conflicts that cause greater geopolitical tension, that as well raises the overflight risks because of the escalation of hostilities amongst the various parts of the world. So besides the severe security risks, which we all unaware of the unsafe skies, or what unsafe skies poses upon the aviation community, it can also be extremely limiting in terms of the commercial aspirations of a lot of the air carriers globally, and it adds pressure on aviation security divisions. So, and particularly those who are responsible for conducting risk assessments within air carriers. So. And it also adds pressure on states who are responsible enough to conduct risk assessments and issue aeronautical information and NOTAMs and publications to advise operators and the general public about risks emanating from a particular state. So there are certainly concerns amongst the aviation community and certainly amongst air operators in different operating forms that over the inadequate government intelligence sharing, and certainly reluctancy by some states who are involved in conflict to divulge threat information for different reasons. So some do not wish to sacrifice overflight charges by closing their airspace, and others that are involved in conflict feel that by disclosing threat information in relation to their aerospace, it could potentially have adverse reputational impact. It can harm their reputation, their commercial, economic sort of aspirations in that country. And some feel that it would be an acknowledgement that they are unable to protect their skies, to safeguard aviation within their territories. Hence, we don't see a lot of publications or aeronautical and NOTAM information coming from those states. As a lot of us know, ICAO Annex 17, of which 193 member states are members, require states to share threat information with one another in order to help protect their national interests, and by advising the air carriers through their national civil aviation authorities on any specific risks, and it helps them conduct their own risk assessments. Air carriers then can take this information, besides any other open source intelligence they can get hold of when conducting the risk assessment. Risk assessment needs information, needs access to credible, verifiable, actionable threat-related information. With the absence of that, the output of the risk assessment would be questionable. John referenced the Dutch safety board, and some of it's some of the work that is been, and Nico as well, some of the work that is being done there. But in a brief I personally attended by the board that spoke to the downing of the MH17 over the Ukraine, it spoke with authority about the lack of sufficiently about states that do not sufficiently share information with one another. If we go back further, 20 years ago, the 9/11 Commission report, for those that have read it, again, is no different. It highlights the lack of intelligence sharing. So all of this represents really a lot of challenge to the aviation community, and certainly further asserts the need for the establishment of a methodical security risk management framework amongst states for collaborative approach, and certainly amongst air carriers as a whole. And certainly air carriers are encouraged in a number of countries to reach out to their national civil aviation authorities to seek threat information, seek access to information, have a collaborative risk management framework. Based on the current geopolitical dynamics now in the mid to long term, it is unlikely that significant shift in tension that I mentioned earlier would occur, which would inherently continue to place added pressure and ultimately responsibility on air operators while conducting their own risk assessments. And that further also asserts the need for the Safer Skies, the value of the Safer Sky initiatives. A couple of points from me as well, Marcelo, if I may. Now, ICAO member states also need to develop capabilities to assess risks and threats to their aerospace. And most importantly, and transparently and proactively and reactively issue information to other states and air operators relating to their skies to keep the skies safe. To do this effectively, there are numerous models to help states achieve that. As we know, the only handful of states are involved in the issuance of aeronautical information and security NOTAMs per se, but the vast majority don't. So to do this, it would require to ensure that states have live monitoring capabilities of conflict zone through various means, including, but again, not limited to, analysts, employing analysts to do that on their behalf, to monitor unsafe aerospace. Empower them with the right tools and intelligence gathering and collection capabilities, open source and connections with law enforcement and others to achieve our objectives. Today, 474 souls were unjustly vanished on the MH17 and PS752. This is a further testament for the work that further work needs to be done in order to address the real risk that we are under. And once again, I applaud Canada in the leadership role it's taken in the Safer Sky initiative to try to achieve just that.
Thank you, Hani, for those comments. And before we start the discussion, I think I'd like to, what I understand so far from what you have shared with our audience today is that reliable and timely information is key to move forward alongside capabilities and other aspects that you mentioned. But I would like to know, I mean, we know about ICAO document 184 that has been established as a guidance for states to conduct those risk assessments and improve their risk mitigation. But I would like to know, perhaps Matthew and Hani, if you can tell us a bit from an airline perspective, what are the tools and best practices that airlines are taking on top of that sort of expectation that states will share information with them, but knowing that not all states share that information. So what are the tools and best practices that airlines have put in place to remedy that gap these days?
Go for it, Hani. Age first.
I will leave the best to last, Matt. You go first.
All right. Look, there's plenty of theoretical guidance out there. I'll give ICAO a plug. Doc 100.84, 2018, 2019, I think it was published. All the stakeholders on this call had an opportunity to comment, and there's an ongoing reiteration of that document available or in progress right now to continue that modernization of the guidance. So, but from an air carrier point of view, it's a combination of just managing sources, developing degrees of reliability and cooperation of that information source, in lieu of some of that, I guess you could say, government endorsed, government information that may not necessarily contain the threat piece, right, which is classically classified in terms of how governments develop sources, but at least the risk assessment judgment piece, right, and that's the real key area for airlines is just understanding not only their own state of registry, their own authority, and in the case of John with the amount of Canadian operators, but also the authorities in which airspace they use, transit or point to point. So I'll let Hani get into the actual detail on how they develop open source information strategies, and take it from there.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for that, Matt. So Marcelo, I'll probably speak to the human intelligence side of things. Besides the documents, besides the guidance, besides the legal framework, what I found from experience, and I can speak to Matthew as well, because both of us have been in the same boat, in the same era, in the same region over the past 10 years doing the same thing, where we're both responsible for security for 2 different airlines. Human intelligence and contacts and networks speaks volume when it comes to risk assessment. Having alliances. Matthew was the head of security of an air carrier. I was the head of security of an air carrier. We were able to pick up the phone on one another and exchange information that we're able to exchange to help inform one another's risk assessment. Whilst we fully appreciate that commercial air operators compete, luckily and thankfully, when it came to safety and security, there was no competition. We shared the same goal. We both want to do the right thing for one another, and we will both enable one another's operation. And that really works quite well in the industry. Personally, having been a head of security of an air carrier, I was also the chairman of the One World Alliance. And within that alliance, for every intelligence sharing and information sharing amongst the heads of security of every alliance member was top on our agenda. We developed programs and framework to enable us to share good information, good intelligence together. Equally, I was the chair of the Arab Air Carriers Association's Security Intelligence Task Force. 33 airlines would do exactly the same in the Middle East and the Arab world. So amongst individuals, people have the will and the appetite to help one another. And that really helps significantly. But another to inform one's risk assessment. Another layer would be an on-ground assessment. So it's a wide array of things between open source collection of data through commercially available sources, between governments and non-governments and word of mouth and others and media, etc. But on-ground assessment, Marcelo, you and I have been on the ground on a few conflict zones to do an on-ground assessment, to get an actual picture from the ground to help inform our internal risk assessment. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's a combination of multiple remedies that help inform one's risk assessment.
Thank you, Hani.
Sorry, Marcelo,
sorry,
can
Nico.
I add something on that? Because
Absolutely.
I think the information sharing of the industry is very good. And I think the fact that the alliances and the regional airline groups share their information that they have available is applaudable. What we miss is that states and governments and intelligence agencies around the world do the same. If you're not part of an alliance and you're a very small airline, you cannot keep your passengers as safe as the bigger airlines or the airlines in alliances that share the public available information. The small airline doesn't have the capability to look into all those public available information and make their own risk assessment in the same level. That can only be done if the information available is shared by governments so that they know that they can rely on the information that really comes from the state itself, where the conflict is or that are involved in the conflict, or with states that have intelligence about that region. We saw that, as was mentioned before, we saw in 9/11 that intelligence sharing is very difficult. We saw it again with the MH17, where some governments seem to have more information than others and shared that information with the airlines, but not with all airlines. we have to make a shift in the way we think. We have to make the whole aviation safer by sharing the information, and not only between states, but also between the stakeholders. And for us as air navigation service providers, it's very important that when we allow an aircraft to fly a certain route on a certain airspace, that we know that it's safe to fly there, that it's safe to take off, that it's safe to land, or that it's safe to fly that area. And for that, you need a good risk assessment. And I think that is, and again, perhaps I keep on repeating myself, but information sharing is so important. Thank you.
Can I add something to that, Marcelo? I think this is, I mean, this is the meat of the conversation of this panel, right? Is the whole information sharing, and I think I've been to, I don't know how many, forums or panels in the last 5 years, and this topic keeps on being brought up, and everyone agrees that it's super important. And like Nico said, it's something that we recognize that is critical to risk assessments, but it's not something easy to do. It's actually one of the deliverables for the Safer Skies Consultative Committee to explore ways, avenues that we can actually broaden that alliance, as Annie was saying, to make sure that no one is left behind and that they have that information. But I think one thing that's important here is info sharing is important, but also the educational piece about the actual risk assessment methodology. So sometimes we are limited by the level of information, the way it's classified. But if we understand the methodologies on how risk assessments are being conducted and what are exactly the triggers that are driving the outcomes that we're seeing, it could be either through flight prohibitions, NOTAMs, advisories. If we understand the process that is actually driving those outcomes, then that in itself is a step forward, because there are certain information out there, despite the classification, that could be sanitized. We can understand the triggers, and then states, by looking and understanding the methodology that's being, used through different states or different groups, they will actually understand what that information implicitly means, and they'll actually be looking for specific triggers in order to inform their own risk assessment processes. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Now, and now I have a question for the group. Hani shared the other day a map of conflict zone around the world, and if I remember correctly, there are approximately between 25 and 30 at the moment. 25. Thank you, Hani. And so my question is, going back to the Safer Skies initiative, which is a multilateral initiative to improve safety in the skies. I think we can say that most of the world would agree with the principles we've discussed today, which is information sharing, reliability, timeliness, capabilities, capacity building, contingency arrangements. But also, I was wondering if it would be perhaps more cost-effective to just address the problem areas instead of going and trying to get agreement on something that everyone agrees on. Perhaps there's some specific states that need that capacity building, and perhaps the international community should be focusing on those states specifically. Is that something possible to do? Perhaps I'll start with John for this.
Yeah, absolutely, Marcelo. Is it possible? Definitely, it's definitely possible, and it's on the agenda again for the Safer Skies Initiative, is to actually build that global capacity. When we look at risk assessments, although there's a process involved, there's different expertise that is required. There is different understanding. So yes, you need that political will, you need that technical expertise, you need the risk expertise, you need many different players to carry out an effective risk assessment process. Now, there's many theories, there's many material out there, and there's definitely opportunities for awareness and education. And I think by looking at that map, it's obviously that, there is opportunities for capacity building, but it's a combination of different elements that are required. So, we could target a particular state, we could target a particular region, but we have to make sure that the culture required to drive this to an area that is acceptable is there. from a political will perspective, from the resources to put in those efforts, all that is actually required to drive that change. Now, in terms of capacity building, it's something that we know that international organizations are putting together. We don't want to overwhelm a state with capacity building opportunities. Capacity building is good, but when you get into a particular state, we need to understand the context. So it's not a question of getting into a particular state and saying, this is how you're going to do things from now on. It's really understanding that context, the environment, and how do we actually drive change? How do we influence individuals to take on the safety and security culture to make sure that, you know what, as Annie was saying, you know, he was talking about competition from operators. I think one thing that we agree is that there is no compromise to safety and security, and we need to understand that. And when the risk, you know, reaches a level that is above that thresh tolerance level of risk, then we need to take action. So in terms of targeting specific regions, absolutely. And that's what the Safer Skies Initiative is about. You know, we have different members sitting in this panel that are part of that group. It's about leveraging that global expertise. So, you know, every state can benefit from. Thank you.
John.
Marcelo, it was in a discussion we had yesterday, the group here, it was quite compelling. I think trying to put our fingers on the pulse or find some of the root cause to where we are today. We put in this map yesterday and we kind of debated it. And although there are 25 countries and territories or regions that have established risks or security risks of some sort, most of which are not far from the Middle East and Africa, interestingly, and John made a great point yesterday, that the NOTAMs that exist, highlighting the risks to the majority of those states, do not come from those states. So here lies one of the key root cause issues here, and it speaks to transparency and proactive capability to identifying risks, highlighting risks and threats to the international community, and being transparent and honest to help the aviation, to help prevent another catastrophe.
And Hani, do you think this has to do with that states have different tolerant risks, or you know, perhaps operators as well? So operators, by operating in some regions that might be considered risky or no fly for some carriers, sort of also continue this gray zone where states feel that they don't have to really issue any NOTAMs because carriers are anyways flying over their territories?
Yeah, so I think it's probably all of the above. One of the issues is actually the acknowledgement that there is a capability that the acknowledgement of some states that they need to develop such capability. So acknowledging there is a problem and start working on how to address this problem by developing a threat identification mechanism capability, identification first. And then once you have the capability established, start working on the how to communicate that further internally and externally in a very efficient way. What makes it slightly, and that's not justification, these are the justifications I hear when I speak to authorities globally, is why don't you have this capability? The response is often because the police does it, because the intelligence services does it for us, but the front-facing agency that speaks to the aviation community in most of the world is the appropriate authority, is the civil aviation authority in that state. So there needs to be internal work that needs to be done between law enforcement agencies and those responsible for identifying threats, communicating that with civil aviation authorities, enabling them and enabling them to communicate this further internally and externally.
Mm-hmm.
Marcelo, I just want to add to that. Annie, you nailed it. I think when you look at that map, that is great, and there's certain limitations. I think we've made reference to it when we talked about capacity building, when we talk about the different states issuing NOTAMs. sometimes there's just not that governance in place. There's some states that are very limited by their legal framework and what they can do and what they cannot do. But I think the message of that slide is that if we have a coalition of countries, if we have, you know, an initiative such as Safer Skies, and we look at particular risks, and when those risks are not being mitigated, this is where the global community has to come together and basically show, you know what, there's still a risk here. Despite what the state believes, there's still a state here, and we will be basically communicating that risk, either through NOTAMs, either through information sharing. So that's one thing that's important too. The other thing that's important, which is basically part of one of the principles that we want to institute through the Safer Skies, is that, you know, in that map, there are, you know, many states of conflict, but there are certain states of conflict that we know, and we have not issued NOTAMs. Canada has not issued NOTAMs. Some of our partners have not issued NOTAMs, and that because there's trust in the system. We know that those states in conflicts or near conflict zones are actually looking at, you know, adequate mitigations in place. They're doing continuous monitoring. They're looking at the risk assessments on a weekly or daily basis. So that creates global trust. And once we have that feeling that a state has things in control, then I think we can go a long ways with that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Nico.
Yeah, I think what we saw after the Malaysian ICAO directly came together and talked about how can we make a sort of repository of safety risk or conflict zones. The problem that you run into if you have one entity responsible for deciding if an airspace is safe or not safe, you directly open it to liability. So if that entity that is then responsible for declaring something safe or not safe is saying it's safe and something happens, then that entity is liable for the fact that they allow someone to fly over it. And if they say it's not safe, then they're liable for all the costs for airlines to overfly it or the country itself for missing resources while it is safe. So therefore, the most important part is that the state concerns takes its responsibility for make a real internal risk assessment. And that is mostly the difficulty. How do you tell yourself that you don't have it into hand anymore to control your airspace safely? And that can be an internal conflict, like we have in some countries where insurgents are trying to make your country unsafe and therefore the airspace. And how do you internally make a good risk assessment of yourself? I am now out of control, and now the risk is in such a case that I should tell the world that I'm out of control. And there is one of the difficulties. The other one is public and political and revenues, but internally to make a good risk assessment. And I think that's what we try to do in the Safer Sky Consultative Committee, try to give information to states. How do you make a risk assessment? Take into account the precautionary principle and look into that you give that information to the stakeholders as well as possible. So that is the most important, I think. And again, information sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. And to the question of airspace and control of the airspace, something that I want to address with the group as well is I've seen cases where two countries actually are disagreeing over who controls the airspace. Like I've seen it in a couple of regions around the world. Now, what are the limitations of the current risk assessment methodologies to address those situations? I mean, I've seen it in the Gulf, and I've seen it in the Crimea region, where at a point there was a disagreement, and this was not a disagreement over a few hours. I'm talking days, where we wouldn't know who's controlling that airspace. How are we addressing this, or is the Safer Skies initiative including those type of cases? So perhaps I start with John.
Sorry, Marcelo. I was looking for my mute button here. Good question. I think it goes back to the question of governance. Now, who controls the airspace? You know, there's sovereignty issues there that we can discuss for many, many hours, and we don't want to get into this, you know, current panel. But I think what's important here is depending on what the outcome of the risk assessment is, and if there is a risk that is identified that is above that tolerance level, that we actually take any means that we have at our disposal to actually mitigate those risks. Now, I was just trying to get familiar with the Zoom platform, and I know there's a number of questions. And I think one of the questions is, you know, what is the purpose of a NOTAM? Is it for the pilot's benefit, or is it for government interference? Now, the benefit of a NOTAM is really about the safety of that aircraft. That's why we have NOTAMs in place. It could be driven by many reasons. But I think we have to look at two things here. There's two critical assets that we need to protect, which are, you know, the passengers in that aircraft. And by default, that aircraft, we're protecting the passengers. So when we look at airspace management, we look at risk assessments, those are the scenarios that we're trying to prevent here, is basically that we cannot compromise safety and security. And this is what we need to protect. So despite of sovereignty issues, we have to take all means at our disposal to protect those critical assets. Thank you.
Anyone else? Hani? Or Nico?
Yes, a question, Marcelo, again.
The question about when two countries disagree over who controls the airspace.
Yeah, so this is something that is quite beyond air operators' control, right? They are kind of at the receiving end as a result of a border conflict, regional conflict, territorial conflict among states, and sadly, the aviation sector gets caught in a crossfire. Now, air carriers' risk appetite differs significantly. Some will just stay completely clear from this particular area or region or aerospace or FIRs. Others need to operate for various reasons. Now, those that make a decision to continue to operate over a disputed territory in terms of control need to have a very good situational awareness, need to have a very good communication capabilities, contingency planning, crisis management, proactive and reactive monitoring, and a live monitoring of the situation while it's ongoing there. And they need to have a very robust risk assessment that all of those risks that you've just identified there, which is the lack of control or a disputed control, need to be documented as a threat, and to document what is the inherent risk resulting of that threat, etc. So situational awareness, build it into the risk assessment. Should your risk appetite, a risk threshold as an air operator permits you to operate into this territory, as long as it's built in there, it's an acceptable level of risk for you as an operator. We see operators having the appetite to penetrate those markets, and others don't.
Thank you, Hani. Nico.
Yeah, thank you, Marcelo, and I fully agree with Hani about that it is a risk assessment. It's more a safety risk, because you might have different opinions from the air navigation service providers of the two disputing areas. What I used to fly sometimes over areas where there was a sort of dispute who was responsible, and then as pilot you put both the frequencies on and try to get your mental picture of where the aircraft is in both control parties. So what we also see in some areas, if the conflict between the states is not too big, that at least on the technical level for the air navigation service providers, they talk to each other, they share the information, so that on the work floor, they still work together to make sure that where they're responsible, it's still safe, because that's what they are there for. Although on the governments, they tell them you are responsible for this whole area and the other one is responsible for the whole area. They try to coordinate to keep at least their own traffic that they are under control to keep safe. So, and again, it all depends on the risk assessment of the area. What is the conflict, and is there coordination on technical level, and is there capability of the one saying to control that area to do it on a proper way?
Thank you, Nico. Well, unfortunately, we're coming to almost the end of this webinar. I would love to spend more time with you, actually, because this conversation is very fascinating, very relevant for the industry, but also how the global community is coming together to move this forward in an organized fashion, but also build on consensus, and addressing the real issues that need to be addressed, such as the ones you have discussed today, like information sharing, reliability of information, capacity building, and perhaps an open question, and maybe you can just say yes or no. I'm very curious to know if this proliferation of military drones that we've seen in recent years is something that preoccupies the operators and governments, and especially my understanding of military drones is that these are often surprise operations that can very hardly be anticipated or monitored. Are there any plans or talks either at the SSCC or industry to tackle this new trend? Matthew?
Thanks. The most sexy question of the entire panel, I think, right, Marcelo? Thanks for giving it to me. So if I get your question right, what you're talking about is the proliferation of UAM and bad actors weaponizing drones. Is that right?
Yeah, military drones conducting secret surprise operations on individuals on the ground, for example.
Yeah, okay. So look, I think quite simply, there is unilateral, dare I say, ICAO guidance that talks about what Nico was referring to before as that sort of military-civilian deconfliction type arrangements. If we want to double click specifically on the last two events, Ukraine and Tehran, the root causes were lack of military and civil coordination, right? They weren't necessarily, at least what's publicly known, direct action against or direct interference against civil aviation, even though that's what's resulted in. The other point here is there are also a really good list of conflict zones that have actually been successfully managed, where the risks have been well known at the time that they needed to be known, and airlines have who by most extent, airlines are the best in place to be able to carry out these risk assessments, because it's not just the surface to air component, it's also the air to air, the terrain, the weather, the whole range of other factors that go into successful flight dispatch safety, right? So there are plenty of really good examples out there where aviation continues today knowing what's taking place. But to answer your question directly on the military piece, that's really down to sovereign states to work out that interagency cooperation. Yeah, it's publicly known there are parts of the world right now that are experiencing that kind of hostility and the use of that particular vector. Airports around the world are investing in all kinds of counter technology, both civilian and military. But question remains as to who's going to pay for that. But that could be another panel for another day.
Thank you, Matt. Now we have 2 minutes left to this panel, and I would like to offer the opportunity to our panelists to perhaps share with the audience some of their takeaways, perhaps in 15, 20 seconds. And I'll start with Nico.
Thank you, Marcelo. And I think, again, this forum is very good. I think the fact that ICAO keeps on working together with the Canadian government on the Safer Sky initiative is very important. What we see in the Safer Sky Consultative Committee, where we are also a member of, is that states from different regions are part of that, looking into coordinating that and bringing that to their regions from all the regions of the world. And I think we have to work together. Let people know that information sharing is the way forward, risk assessment is the way forward, and the precautionary principle. Thank you.
Thank you. Annie?
Yeah, thank you, Marcelo. So final words from me. So civil aviation should certainly not be a vehicle for political differences and should not be subjected to overflight security risks because of the lack of because of the actions or the inactions of some of the governments in certainly many parts of the world. So civilian aircraft should really have the liberty to ride the skies freely. people trust us, buy tickets with us, to fly with us, we should keep them safe. So we should do that within the auspices of international civil aviation laws. Now, the Canadian government and Transport Canada, thank you one more time for driving this well overdue initiative. Thank you.
And last word from John.
Yeah, thank you, Marcelo. I'll be super brief here. I think the big takeaway for me is here, as I think we have to continue to take every single opportunity to reinforce our global obligations and making sure that the skies remain safe and that any risk to commercial civil aviation aircraft have to be addressed. And we encourage folks to follow the Safer Skies initiative, to endorse it, and looking forward to the next opportunity. Thank you.
So this comes to our webinar comes to an end. We thank you for joining us from all over the world. Thank you to our panelists, Matthew, Hani, John, Nico. Let's the dialogue continue, and I look forward to seeing you all in a different forum in 2022. And happy holidays to everyone. Take care.
Thank you very much.